There's a certain weight that comes with pretending everything in your life is perfect, when, deep down, cracks are splitting it apart. My name is Elena Mayer. On the outside, my life might look like the picture of stability: a loving husband, two stepsons who seem well adjusted, and a home that always feels lived in. But appearances don't always reflect reality. It wasn't always this way. When I first married Edwin, I believed I'd found someone who truly understood me. He was grounded, focused, and steady, a rock I could lean on. But somewhere along the line, he became more like a ghost in our home. Work took over his life, leaving me with polite smiles and short conversations instead of meaningful moments. It's not that he stopped caring entirely, but it felt like he was pouring everything into providing for us while leaving nothing of himself behind. And then there were the boys, Yahir and Nixon. Yahir, Edwin's oldest, had always been polite but distant. He was quiet, observant, and, at times, a little too intense for comfort. Nixon, on the other hand, had an energy that filled the house. He was sharp, sarcastic, and always knew how to get under Yahir's skin. Despite their differences, they were close in a way that sometimes made me feel like an outsider. I tried hard to connect with them, especially Yahir. After all, he was almost an adult, and I knew how important it was for us to get along. But no matter what I did, family dinners, offering to help with school projects, even just sitting down and asking how his day went, there was always this wall. It was like he didn't fully trust me, and I couldn't figure out why. Edwin didn't seem to notice the disconnect. Or maybe he didn't want to. His solution to everything was patience. "They'll warm up to you," he said once, as if time alone could fix what felt irreparably broken. And so, I waited. But waiting turned into frustration, and frustration turned into resentment. Then came the day I noticed something strange. I was folding laundry when I realized several pairs of my underwear were missing. At first, I assumed they'd just been misplaced, maybe mixed in with Edwin's clothes, or left behind in the dryer. But after a quick search, I knew something wasn't right. It wasn't until I saw Yahir hurrying out of the laundry room one afternoon that my suspicion took root. His face turned red the moment he saw me, and he mumbled something about needing clean socks before bolting down the hall. I wanted to believe it was nothing, I really did. But my gut told me otherwise. Later that night, I decided to check his room while he was out. I felt sick even doing it, but the nagging voice in my head wouldn't let it go. What I found confirmed everything. Stuffed in the back of his closet, hidden beneath a pile of old clothes, were several pairs of my underwear, including the ones I thought had gone missing. My stomach twisted. I should have walked away right then and there. I should have waited for Edwin to come home and let him handle it. But instead, I stayed. I stayed long enough to see Yahir walk in and freeze when he spotted me holding the evidence in my hand. The look on his face, shame, fear, and something else I couldn't quite name, made my heart pound. Neither of us spoke for what felt like forever. And then, finally, he broke the silence. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know. I just needed something that felt close to something real." His words hit me harder than I expected. He looked so desperate, so lost in that moment, that I didn't know whether to be angry or heartbroken. I told him it couldn't happen again, that this crossed a line, but instead of demanding answers or storming out, I did something else. I asked him if he needed help. To this day, I still don't know why I said it. Maybe it was guilt for not being the maternal figure he needed. Or maybe it was my own loneliness, looking for an excuse to feel useful. Either way, I regretted it almost immediately. Yahir looked at me with wide eyes, like he couldn't believe what he was hearing. And when I clarified what I meant, offering to buy him something appropriate to satisfy whatever needs he had, he actually smiled. A week later, I followed through. I went to a store I'd never imagined stepping foot in, and I bought something I thought would fix the problem. It was awkward handing it to him, but he seemed grateful. For a while, I thought that was the end of it. Things went back to normal. Or so I thought. Then came the text. It was late, and Edwin was out of town for work again. My phone buzzed, and when I saw Yahir's name, I assumed it was something simple. Maybe a question about groceries or whether his dad had called. But it wasn't. It was a video. My heart raced as I opened it, and I knew immediately what I was looking at. Yahir, using the toy I'd bought him. I should have deleted it. I should have blocked his number and told Edwin everything. Instead, I froze. And then I hit play. I don't know how many times I watched it before reality came crashing down. The next day, Yahir claimed it was a mistake, that he meant to send it to someone else. But the way he looked at me afterward told me everything I needed to know. It wasn't a mistake, and neither was the way my stomach flipped every time I thought about it. I convinced myself it was harmless, that I was just flattered by the attention after so many months of feeling invisible. But deep down, I knew better. And as much as I wanted to stop what was happening, part of me didn't. I thought I could put the video behind me, pretend it hadn't happened. But it lingered. Every time I looked at Yahir, flashes of that night crept into my thoughts. For the next few days, I avoided being alone with him. I'd make sure the kitchen was clean before he got home, retreat to my room early, and stay busy with meaningless chores. It worked, for a while. But Yahir noticed. Did I do something wrong? He asked one evening, leaning against the counter while I prepped dinner. I could feel his eyes watching me, waiting for me to crack. My hands fumbled with the knife, and I had to remind myself to breathe. No, I said, forcing a smile. Why would you think that? He shrugged but didn't look convinced. Later that night, he sent another message. It wasn't a video this time, just words. I didn't mean to make things weird, I swear. I just wanted to show you I was grateful, that's all. I didn't respond right away. I stared at the screen, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. My heart pounded as I typed and deleted several drafts, before settling on something neutral. It's fine, I'm glad it's helping. But it wasn't fine, and we both knew it. Over the next few days, things shifted. Yahir wasn't just polite anymore. He was attentive. He'd linger in the kitchen while I cooked, offering to help even when I told him I didn't need it. He'd compliment my hair, my outfits, even the way I laughed. It wasn't over the top, but it was enough to make my skin flush. The worst part? I liked it. For the first time in months, someone was looking at me like I mattered, like I was wanted, and that terrified me. I kept telling myself it was harmless, that it was just a phase for him, and that he'd lose interest eventually. But one night, as I folded laundry, another message popped up on my phone. This time, it wasn't words. It was another video. I froze. My hands trembled as I tapped the screen. I shouldn't have watched it, but I did. And this time, I didn't stop after the first play. I tried to convince myself he'd sent it to the wrong person again, that it was all just a misunderstanding. But when I looked at him the next morning, the look in his eyes told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't an accident. Yahir was pushing boundaries, and I wasn't stopping him. The next day, he brought it up. Did you see what I sent you? I pretended to be busy, folding towels to avoid eye contact. You didn't mean to send it to me, I said quickly, trying to shut the conversation down. But he didn't let it go. What if I did? My heart skipped. Yahir, this isn't funny. I'm not joking. He stepped closer, and I felt my pulse quicken. I don't want things to be weird between us, he said softly. I feel like we understand each other. More than anyone else in this house. His words hit me harder than they should have, because deep down, I knew he was right. I wanted to be angry. I wanted to tell him to stop, to set clear boundaries and walk away. But instead, I let the moment linger. And that's when I realized I wasn't as in control of this situation as I thought. If you're still here, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to this channel for more stories like this. I should have trusted my instincts. From the moment Edwin told me he and Nixon had to leave early for the family gathering, leaving Yahir and me to drive down later, I felt it. That uneasy pull in my stomach. I told myself I was being dramatic. It was just a drive, 5 hours, maybe 6, and we'd meet up with the rest of the family. But the tension was there, sitting between us like a weight I couldn't shake. Yahir offered to take the wheel after the first 2 hours, and I let him. I needed the break, or at least that's what I told myself. Watching him focus on the road, hands steady on the wheel, I couldn't stop thinking about how different he looked lately. Older, more confident. And I hated myself for noticing. When the rain started, I tried to think of anything but him. The wipers dragged across the windshield, the car crawling forward in traffic. I kept glancing at the clock, calculating how late we'd be. I didn't want to stop for the night, but I knew I didn't have it in me to keep driving. We pulled into a small motel off the highway. It wasn't much, just a place to sleep. But when the receptionist said they only had one room, my stomach turned. I almost said no. Almost told her we'd keep driving through the rain. But I didn't. I told myself it was fine. It was just one night. And yet, when we stepped into that room and saw the single bed, I knew I'd made a mistake. I kept myself busy, unpacking a bag I didn't need to unpack. I brushed my hair longer than necessary and changed into the plainest pajamas I could find, hoping it would dull whatever tension had been simmering all day. It didn't. Yahir sat on the edge of the bed, scrolling through his phone like he hadn't noticed how close we were. But I noticed. I felt his presence every second. Then he spoke. His words weren't complicated, just an observation about how much I did for everyone, how no one ever asked how I was doing. I tried to laugh it off, tried to act like it didn't hit me right where it hurt. But when I turned around and saw the way he was looking at me, like I was someone worth noticing, I froze. I should have shut it down. I should have said goodnight and turned off the lights. Instead, I sat down beside him. I don't know who moved first. Maybe it was me, maybe it was him. But suddenly, the space between us wasn't there anymore. It didn't feel wrong, not at first. It felt like being wanted, like being seen. I told myself it was a mistake as soon as it was over. I told myself it wouldn't happen again. But as I lay there staring at the ceiling, I already knew I was lying. The drive the next morning was suffocating. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. Yahir sat beside me, quiet but calm. Too calm. I hated him for it, even as part of me envied how easy it seemed for him to move past what had happened. I couldn't stop replaying it in my head. The way it felt. The way I didn't hesitate. Edwin greeted us with a hug when we finally arrived, like nothing had changed. Nixon barely looked up from his phone. It should have been a relief, but it wasn't. I felt exposed, like the truth was written all over my face. I avoided Yahir as much as I could, but it didn't matter. Every time our eyes met, I felt that pull again. And worse, I could tell he felt it too. I told myself it was over. I told myself I'd pretend it never happened and move on. But Yahir didn't let me. He didn't push, didn't corner me. Instead, he lingered. He stayed close, offering to help with dishes, finding excuses to brush past me in the kitchen. And every time, my resolve cracked a little more. The worst part was how easy it became to justify it. Edwin barely noticed me anymore. He was too busy, too tired, too distracted. And Yahir noticed everything. But I wasn't the only one who noticed. It started small. Nixon making comments about how Yahir and I seemed close lately. Asking why he was always around me, why we kept disappearing to clean up after dinner, or rearrange the garage. I brushed him off, laughed at his jokes, and told myself he was just being nosy. But the way he looked at me made my stomach twist. And then, one night, everything changed. I had just finished cleaning the kitchen. Yahir had left an hour earlier, but Nixon stayed behind, scrolling through his phone at the counter. I was halfway to my room when he called after me. "I saw you!" I stopped, my heart pounding so hard I could barely hear him over it. I told myself he couldn't know. He couldn't have seen anything. But when I turned around, Nixon's face was steady. Too steady. He didn't say it outright. He didn't have to. All he said was that he wasn't planning to tell Edwin. Not yet. I felt relief, for a split second. Then came the fear. He didn't have to tell Edwin to destroy me. One wrong word, one look, and everything I'd tried to protect would come crashing down. I wanted to believe he'd keep my secret. I wanted to believe he wouldn't go there. But the way he smiled before walking out of the kitchen told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't over. Not even close. I thought I had control. For weeks, I convinced myself that no one noticed the tension between me and Yahir. I told myself we were careful. Too careful for anyone to suspect a thing. But Nixon was smarter than I gave him credit for. He'd always been observant, picking up on details most people missed. At first, I brushed off his questions and teasing remarks as harmless. But then it changed. I was in the laundry room folding clothes when my phone buzzed. A message from Nixon. My stomach sank before I even opened it. It wasn't words. It was a video. I felt my pulse hammering in my ears as I tapped the screen. The footage was grainy, but there was no mistaking it. Yahir and me, caught in a moment I'd tried so hard to forget. I couldn't breathe. Nixon must have been outside the room that night, listening, recording. And now he had proof. I wanted to scream, to cry, to storm into his room and beg him to delete it. But before I could even think straight, another message appeared. "We need to talk." I found him in his room, sitting casually on his bed like nothing was wrong. I didn't even get the chance to speak before he held up his phone. "Relax," he said. "I'm not sending this to Dad. Not if you do what I ask." His words hit me like ice water. "Ask?" I choked out. He didn't blink. "You're going to make this worth my while. Or this," he tapped his phone, "goes straight to him." My entire world tilted. I tried reasoning with him, tried begging him to delete it, but he just smirked. Nixon wasn't playing games. He knew he had me, and he wasn't afraid to use it. The demands started small, late-night errands, cash for things he wouldn't explain, but they grew fast. I told myself I was protecting my family, protecting Edwin. If he found out what I'd done, it would destroy him. It would destroy all of us. But the more Nixon asked, the less I recognized myself. I wasn't Elena anymore. I was his puppet, doing whatever it took to keep my secret buried. And the worst part? Yahir had no idea. The guilt was unbearable. Every time Nixon looked at me, it felt like he was tightening a noose I couldn't escape. But Yahir made it worse. He wasn't the same boy I'd tried to comfort all those weeks ago. He was different now, more confident, more possessive. He didn't ask for my attention, he expected it. And I gave it. I hated myself every time I did. But I couldn't stop. I couldn't stop when he brushed past me in the kitchen, his hand lingering just a second too long. I couldn't stop when he waited up for me after Edwin had gone to bed, leaning against the counter with that same look he'd given me in the motel room. I told myself it wasn't real, that it was just an illusion, something I'd created out of desperation. But the way Yahir looked at me made it feel real, and Nixon saw it all. One night, after Edwin had fallen asleep, Nixon cornered me in the hallway again. "You think no one notices," he said. "But I do." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You're not as careful as you think." I wanted to slap him, to scream at him, but all I could do was stand there, frozen. "You know what I want," he said before walking away. I felt sick. The demands grew darker. Nixon wanted more. Not just errands or cash, he wanted my time, my attention. And as his demands escalated, so did Yahir's jealousy. He started asking questions about why Nixon suddenly needed so much from me, about why I always looked so tense. I lied, again and again I lied. But Yahir didn't believe me. He started pushing harder, showing up in places he knew Nixon might be, keeping an eye on me like he could sense something was wrong. It didn't help that Edwin had started noticing too. He'd been distracted for so long that I thought he'd never see it. But lately, he'd been asking questions about why I seemed tired, why I'd been so distracted, why Nixon had suddenly stopped arguing with me. He even asked if I was okay. I told him I was fine. But I wasn't fine. I was unraveling. I couldn't keep up the lies. I couldn't keep pretending. Every time Nixon sent another text, my heart pounded so hard I thought it might stop. Every time Yahir got too close, I felt like I was drowning. I wanted out. But there was no way out. If I told Edwin the truth, I'd lose him. I'd lose everything. If I gave Nixon what he wanted, I'd lose myself. And Yahir wasn't letting go. I felt like I was trapped in a nightmare that kept repeating itself, and no matter how many times I woke up, I couldn't escape. I thought I could handle Nixon. I thought if I gave him what he wanted, just enough to keep him quiet, he'd eventually lose interest and let me breathe again. But blackmail doesn't work that way. The more I gave, the more he took. He started texting me late at night, asking me to come to his room just to talk. At first, I thought maybe he wanted to confront me about what I'd done. Maybe he'd have a moment of clarity and decide to let it go. But that wasn't it. Nixon wasn't letting anything go. If anything, he was enjoying it. The power. The control. And I let him. But it wasn't enough for him to own my secret. He wanted to push me further, to see how far he could go before I snapped. And I snapped. It started with another text, this time a video clip. I hadn't even opened it before my hands started shaking. I stormed into his room without knocking, slamming the door behind me. I told him it had to stop. I told him I couldn't take it anymore. But he just laughed. "You're not going anywhere," he said, "unless you want Dad to see this." I don't remember what I said after that. All I know is that my voice was loud enough to draw Yahir's attention. He burst through the door, and the look on his face, the anger, the betrayal, was worse than anything I could have imagined. I didn't even have time to explain before Yahir lunged at Nixon. The room erupted. Yahir was shouting, Nixon was laughing, egging him on. And I just stood there, frozen. By the time I pulled Yahir back, Nixon was smirking like he'd won. "You really thought you could keep this a secret forever?" he said. I don't know what came over me, but suddenly, everything spilled out. I told them everything, how it started, why it happened, how I'd let it go too far. I couldn't stop myself. The words kept coming, like once I started, I couldn't put them back in. When it was over, Yahir looked at me like he didn't recognize me anymore. And Nixon? He just stood there, holding his phone like it was a loaded weapon. And I'd hoped telling the truth would make me feel lighter. But it didn't. It just made everything heavier. I tried to act normal. I tried to cook dinner, clean the house, and go through the motions like nothing had changed. But Edwin wasn't stupid. I could feel his eyes on me at the table, watching the way I flinched whenever Nixon spoke, or how I couldn't meet Yahir's gaze. "What's going on with you?" he asked later that night. I froze. I told him I was tired, that the trip had worn me out, and he let it go, for the moment. But I knew it wouldn't last. The next morning, he asked again. I snapped at him. I couldn't help it. The pressure was unbearable, and I took it out on him. And that's when I saw it, the doubt in his eyes. Edwin had always trusted me, but not anymore. He didn't say anything right away, but I knew he was watching. He noticed how Nixon lingered around me, how Yahir barely spoke at dinner anymore. The walls were closing in, and I had no way out. Nixon still had the video. Yahir was hurt and angry, and Edwin was starting to put the pieces together. I wanted to confess. I wanted to rip the Band-Aid off and tell Edwin everything, let the truth destroy me so I could finally breathe again. But every time I opened my mouth, fear swallowed the words. I couldn't lose him. I couldn't lose this life I'd built, even if it was built on lies. So I kept pretending. But pretending was exhausting. I jumped every time my phone buzzed, every time Nixon walked into the room, every time Edwin asked another question. And through it all, Yahir just stared at me, silent, angry, and disappointed. I thought losing Edwin would be the worst part, but losing Yahir felt worse. I didn't know who I was anymore, and I didn't know how much longer I could keep it all from falling apart. I thought the worst was over after that night, the screaming, the accusations, the look on Yahir's face when the truth hit him. But the silence that followed, That was worse. Yahir stopped speaking to me entirely. He wouldn't even look at me. He moved through the house like I wasn't there, and every time he walked past me, my stomach dropped. I wanted to fix it, to tell him I was sorry, but I didn't even know where to start. What apology could erase what I'd done? And Nixon? He didn't stop. If anything, the fight with Yahir made him bolder. He knew I couldn't risk pushing him too far, so he used it. Late-night texts, random demands, reminders of what he could do with the video if I didn't give him what he wanted. He'd smile at me across the dinner table, like we shared some secret no one else knew. And I hated him for it. But I hated myself more. I couldn't look Edwin in the eyes without feeling like my lies were written across my face. He kept asking questions, little ones at first. What was wrong? Why was I so tense? Why did Yahir barely speak to me anymore? I kept brushing him off, but the questions didn't stop. He started noticing things. The way Nixon lingered too long when we were alone. The way I flinched every time my phone buzzed. And I knew it was only a matter of time before he put it all together. I thought about leaving. I thought about packing a bag, walking out the door, and never looking back. But what would that solve? The video would still exist. Nixon would still have control. Yahir would still hate me. And Edwin would still be left piecing together the truth without me there to explain it. I couldn't leave. But I couldn't stay either. Every day felt heavier. Every decision felt wrong. And I was running out of ways to keep pretending. I still don't know how it got this far. I think about that night in the motel room, the moment I could have said no. The moment I could have turned away and kept my life intact. But I didn't. And now I can't take any of it back. Yahir doesn't look at me the same way anymore. There's something colder in his eyes, like he's trying to figure out whether he ever really knew me. And Nixon? He still has the video. He still has me. I don't know if he'll ever stop. I don't know if I'll ever be free. And Edwin, he's still asking questions. He's watching me closer now, noticing the cracks in the story I keep telling him. It's only a matter of time before he finds out the truth. Sometimes, I wonder what it would feel like to confess. To let everything come crashing down and finally stop pretending. But then I think about what I'd lose, my home, my family, everything I've tried so hard to hold on to. And I can't do it. Not yet. So I keep pretending. I keep smiling at the dinner table and folding laundry like nothing's wrong. But inside, I'm unraveling. And the worst part is, I don't know how to stop. So here I am, asking you, anyone, what would you do? When everything feels wrong, but the one thing that felt right is the thing you're not supposed to want. When you're torn between fixing what's broken and starting over completely? Let me know in the comments. And if this story made you feel something, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more.